So before starting our first event of a series of 5 public events within the umbrella of the summer school Global Studies and Critical Theory, I have to thank a number of institutions that have made possible to organize this event together with the Academy of Global Humanities and Critical Theory. First of all, the Gramsci Foundation, Fondazione Gramsci Emilia-Romagna, who is co-organizing with us all these public events, and also the Biblioteca dell'Archiginnasio that is hosting all our public events. But together with us, there is a series of other institutions that in some way contributed in a way or another to the organization of the summer school and all the events, and I hope not to forget all of them. So first of all, the city of Bologna, that is giving us the opportunity to use some of the urban spaces and buildings of the city, the Scuola Superiore di Studi Umanistici of the University of Bologna, the Institute of Advanced Studies in the Humanities, the Fibra Foundation, Italy-Brazil, the Unipol, the School of Humanities, the Museum of Modern Art of Bologna, the Opera House, the Museum of Palazzo G, and I hope not to forget any other of the institutions that are co-promoting these events. Today we open our summer school, and it is a great pleasure and honor to have with us Judith Butler. Please, Judith, you want to join us to the podium? No, okay. I'm not going to introduce her since she does not need any kind of introduction. Let me just say that it's a real pleasure and honor to have her with us today. We had the chance to co-organize an event last weekend, an important conference on the critical task of the university in the framework of a new, very important project that Judith is organizing, International Consortium of Critical Theory program. We will have the opportunity to have Judith with us also on Wednesday for a critical dialogue here in Archiginnasio. So she has been very, very generous with us to stay here for all these days. So thank you very much, Judith, for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much. Before I begin, I just want to take the opportunity first to thank Raphael Laverne for his extraordinary organizational efforts. It's rare to have an accomplished intellectual capable of great organizational capacities in the ways that he is. So I'm very grateful to you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here. But I wanted just to say that I'm very pleased today to let you know that we have a special guest who is Digna Rabia, who is an inspiring young activist from Ramallah, Palestine. And would you come up and at least, there you are, okay, beautiful. We'll be leading some special workshops in Bologna as part of the summer school, and I believe that's happening on Wednesday afternoon. Okay. Well, welcome. I'm thrilled you're here. Thrilled you're here. Thank you. So, yes, it's daunting to be here, in many ways daunting. at the Academy for Global Humanities and Critical Theory. In part, the question that I want to address this evening has to do with what the forms are that critical theory takes now. And I'm aware that critical theory may seem to belong to a different time, a specific period of European history in the 20th century, mid-20th century, and that students and faculty in many parts of the world tend to think that it's time to move to new trends, that critical theory is old. And I just want to suggest that the quick move to new trends seems to be bound up with a fear that one might be exposed as somehow behind the times. And this sort of anxiety and speed belongs, I believe, to a market economy of ideas in which it is apparently embarrassing to be caught still interested in the unfinished, incomplete, and still alive character of an older idea or text. So if part of our task together here is to think about what critical theory, what forms critical theory now takes within a global context or frame, surely one thing we should keep in mind is that it will be important to criticize the ways that market values and human capital have come to haunt and to drive our relation to knowledge, producing new forms of anxiety and new fears of exposure. Because if we are driven by the question of what is the new trend in academic life, like, oh, I missed that one, or everyone's talking about something and I haven't read it. I mean, that, of course, is intensified when it's not translated into your language or it's happening in another part of the world. But if we have that, it seems to me that we can find ourselves madly chasing the new, forgetting to ask what from previous forms of thought still live now, what from previous forms of thought are animated in our contemporary thought, or called to be rethought, reanimated in light of new global conditions. It will be a very sad day, for instance, when Marx himself becomes subject to this market anxiety, disparaged and forgotten as outmoded. So in some ways, my task this evening is to become uncool, and to invite you to become uncool with me. I'm sorry about the weather metaphor. To invite you to become uncool with me as we undertake two tasks: to consider critical theory within a global frame and to think about new modalities of violence and death dealing that demand to be thought in a critical way. As you will see, much of what I have to offer this evening centers on the question of what critical now means, drawing on the legacy of its prior meanings, and how even to think the now, the multiplicity of temporal nows, that structure this historical time, if we can speak that way. But also, as I think you will see, I'm interested in bringing to the fore the longing for justice through nonviolent means, the form that the critique of violence takes now, and the problem of living and struggling within a political field marked by fragmented sovereignty. The Frankfurt School identified forms of domination that it understood as crucial to its own time and to a modernity modeled on its own case. That included fascism, technocracy, instrumental reason, the domination or destruction of nature. Because anti-Semitism became a way of talking about all racisms, anti-Semitism also became the paradigmatic way in which the Frankfurt School dealt with the question of race. It sought to establish a form of thought that would not be philosophy, strictly speaking, and that would respond to the historical demands made upon it. That school argued that such thought had to be interdisciplinary because the historical present could not be thought without the resources of a range of disciplines, including aesthetics, philosophy, history, sociology, and economics. Of course, many criticisms can be directed toward that project, starting with the question of whether the Frankfurt School, much like French feminism, ever was a truly unified school or a project. But also, did that school rightly identify the historical demands of its time? By what means did it identify those issues or demands, and what were the geopolitical limits of its understanding of the historical present? Were there, for instance, competing present times for which it had no account? And what difference did it make if we think about the historical present not as a unified reality, but as a field of converging and diverging temporalities? Finally, what does it mean to claim that an historical demand is made of thinking? What form does that demand take? Where does it come from? How is it registered or received? After all, part of the claim is that our own thinking takes shape within an historical field, and that history is not simply outside of thought, as an object to be thought. History is an immanent dimension of thinking. Thinking itself is historical, and it bears its own historicity. To the extent that critical theory of that period insisted on the term critical, it drew in part on Kant. For Kant asked about the conditions and limits of what could be thought, and counseled that we stay within those limits in order not to become speculative or dogmatic. Kant thought less about the historical conditions and limits of thought, but that issue became more important for those who sought to bring Kant forward into critical theory for the present. Indeed, I am tempted to make a strong trans-historical claim, namely that there are always strong historical limits to what any of us can think when we are thinking critically about our times. We have already gained a sense of the possible pitfalls. Who are we? The we. Who is the we who is thinking? And how do we identify the historical demands made on thinking? How do we think about the historical dimension of thinking? And how do we come to identify the limits of what can be thought within any particular historical horizon? If those horizons are multiple, converging and diverging, and sometimes they can only be crossed through acts of epistemic violence, and so precisely not a felicitous fusion of horizons in the Gadameryan sense, then the task of critical theory is also one of thinking between or across temporal frames, activating some of the problems associated with translation and untranslatability. Indeed, coming up against the limits of translatability, the epistemic limits, even the epistemic violence that occurs when we seek to override what is untranslatable in the interests of communication, and where the norms have already been set for establishing what is called clarity. I say this not to celebrate unclarity, but rather to pose the question of what counts as rational and communicable thought, and how do the norms that constrain that definition in advance do violence to modes of communication and expressivity that do not or will not assimilate into its terms. So critical theory within the global frame has to encounter and even productively founder upon the problem of communicability. The idea of disciplines also comes into question. For the Frankfurt School, only an interdisciplinary form of thought could stand a chance of responding to the demands of one's historical time. Given how the disciplines have changed, that proposition takes on another meaning for us. But that claim also bears implications for how the world appears, in what forms, as it were, it gives itself, presents itself. The world does not present itself outside of an interpretation, but that interpretation carries with it the historical impress of that world. Further, those who first gathered under the name of critical theory were in a crisis, trying to think new and accelerating dimensions of an economic and political world for which established concepts proved inadequate. Critical theory emerged surely emerged from Marxism, but the extent to which it remained Marxist is a topic of perpetual debate. That vexed and crucial lineage remains active and alive in critical theory today. It would be, I suggest, nearly impossible to maintain any sort of critical theory without a productive engagement with Marxism. In any case, the mandate to undertake an interdisciplinary project that sought to understand critically the historical conditions of crisis was surely part of what motivated the production of critical theory. It was also established, however, by those who were undertaking intellectual work both within and outside the university, those who understood that they could be and often were expelled from the university or never admitted, facing censorship, fighting or fleeing fascism. They were within the academy and they were outside the academy, and that distinction remains crucial for us. For if critical theory remains sequestered from activism, it has lost the very domain in which the political problematic emerges. This important relation between the inside and outside of the academy is linked to the problem of the border between the university and its world. My own starting point has been to link the effort to dismantle knowledge forms that are bound up with the reproduction of objectionable forms of power to projects of social transformation that seek to realize substantial democratic goals, including freedom, equality, and justice. How to do that is not immediately clear, but it seems to be bound up with the capacity to tell a history and imagine a future, and the realization that time is unevenly distributed, or that various historical moments are at play at the same time, a situation that calls for a way to think present time, what Walter Benjamin called the Jetztzeit, as a constellation of some kind. So the term critical has many senses. In Kant, a critical inquiry is one that interrogates the conditions and limits of what we can know, but also what we can do and that for which we may hope. Reinhard Koselleck, who wrote Critique and Crisis, Enlightenment and the Pathogenesis of Modern Society, published in German in 1959, drew attention to the crisis part of anything that is critical. There are also critical illnesses and critical turning points, and those are ones in which an immediate and thoughtful intervention is necessary. So critical can mean a call for an intervention. He also introduces the notion of conceptual history, which is significantly different from the Frankfurt School approach. And yet, in some sense, both forms of scholarship sought to think about thought, practices, informal and formal institutions that take as their task a thoughtful response to what is most urgent, to that which in our histories urgently makes its demand on thought. Critique, then, might be understood as a way of registering and responding to an historical demand or several set of demands. And that means we have to think about how the world registers, which is, of course, a turn to aesthetics, to art, and to media of several forms. But also, it calls our attention to the incommensurate vocabularies that call to be thought together. Now, I mention Koselleck not because I am a fan, or even because of his association with Carl Schmitt, who many of my colleagues find interesting because of his views on sovereignty, and we are, after all, at least trying to speak about sovereignty here this week and next week, but because it offers a genealogy of the idea of the critical worth considering for our purposes. He was an historian who could not help himself from turning to language. He started with an etymological problem. Time and again, Koselleck poses the problem of how a certain kind of destruction or suffering can come to an end, whether it can end, and what, if anything, could bring about the end to suffering. Crisis is the condition of the critical, not only an historical precondition, but a conceptual presupposition. The ancient Greek krino carries several meanings, including to separate, to part or divorce, but also to choose, to judge, and to decide. The Greek word krinein means both subjective critique and objective crisis. It also implies the notion of measuring oneself, quarreling, or even fighting. So in a crisis, there is a sense of fighting. And for Koselleck, this becomes important since his book, Critique and Crisis, seeks to show how religious wars and the predicament of their resolution gave rise to some of the main notions of critique and crisis that have survived into contemporary vocabulary. It does not exactly characterize a decision critique. To do a critique, to undertake a critique is not the same as making a decision. It actually indicates the time right before a decision is taken, the time in which one is figuring out what decision to make. Thucydides uses the term in his account of the Persian Wars to describe the acceleration of time it takes when a fight is about to conclude. A decision is about to be made, to come around, to take place, but also a form of conflict seems almost ready to come to an end. Of course, crisis carries the sense of a coming to a verdict and also implies a legal procedure of some kind. This sense of verdict or judgment is close to the idea of judgment that we find in Kant. Koselleck holds that in classical Greek usage, there was no easy way of distinguishing between the subjective exercise of criticism and the objective sense of a crisis. The two meanings were, in his words, fused. One could be on either side of a particular issue and still be engaged in critique and taken up by a crisis. There was not my critique or your critique. The sense of debate, if not fight, was there in the original sense of the word. For Koselleck, the term moves from its legal status to a broader political one, such that crisis characterizes any number of political issues that call to be decided, and in relationship to which there are conflicting views. Elections, bills, accepting legal reports, deciding matters of exile, these were crises that called for critique. Crisis preceded and actually helped bring about harmonious conclusions. To be a citizen and to be a judge were not considered to be distinct operations. To be a citizen meant that one had to be able to judge. For the ancient Greeks, then, crisis was a central concept by which justice and the political order could be harmonized through appropriate legal decisions. The Greek translation of the Old and New Testament introduced new meanings, including the idea of a last judgment and the promise of salvation. It also came to take on a medical sense. In the case of illness, crisis refers both to the observable condition and to the judgment about the course of the illness. The way illnesses were diagnosed was not altogether different from how trials were run. A crisis had to be followed by a judgment or a diagnosis. When the term was transposed from legal to social and political domains, it tended to be used as a transitional or temporal concept, what he calls a Verlaufsbegriff, designating a time preceding decision. Indeed, increasingly, a crisis is considered to be an objective condition, financial or diplomatic crisis. But every crisis has to be determined to be one. The determination of a crisis depends on a very specific kind of judgment. Koselleck was interested in those determinations of judgment that an epoch had come to an end or was nearing its end, the end of one time and the beginning of another. So something we call critical judgment emerges precisely at the moment of temporal indeterminacy. What time is it? A crisis is resolved not through the restoration of a prior order. That would be a way of denying the temporal crisis itself. A political crisis is differentiated from a medical crisis that presupposes a state of health as the norm, which is interrupted by a crisis after which that condition of harmony is expected to be more or less restored, depending on how old one is. Koselleck follows the emergence of the term through the 16th through the 20th century as it moves from prophecy to diagnosis. Prophecy is related to the determination that an historical epoch is ending, coming to an end, centering on a battle that will have the power to conclude one time and inaugurate another. With diagnosis, something is wrong or false or diluted, and we need to wait for a correction if we believe in the internal rules and wisdom of the market, and if it's a financial crisis, or we have to take measures into our own hands to induce the restoration of health if we're working within a general medical model or if we believe in economic interventions. Of course, crisis also characterizes the accelerated dynamism of revolutionary processes, a topic extensively examined by crisis theory and the work, for instance, of Klaus Offe. Marx understood crisis as the forcible outbreak of contradictions. Koselleck opposed that view and sought to understand instead how we might go back to diagnosis and prophecy in order to understand our contemporary sense of critique. Now, we could argue against Koselleck that there's a prophetic tradition operating within Marxism as well, though that is not his interest. Instead, Koselleck positions himself against Marx, calling himself a diagnostician, a medical historian, as it were, who seeks to establish the pathogenesis of modernity. Whether Marx is part of that pathology or its resolution remains unconsidered in his view. Koselleck's book is mainly influenced by Hobbesian political philosophy. It's noteworthy for how very little it is willing to discuss Kant in a book dedicated to the notion of critique. And yet, for both Koselleck and Kant, critique is fundamentally bound up with law, with judgment or decision, and with the institution of the tribunal. Koselleck writes, and I quote, "As judgment, trial, and general tribunal, the word crisis was used forensically, so the term contained both pro and con as well as decision." So critique, crisis, the unity of the two, named the entire problem of a conflict that had to be settled legally as well as the legal judgment that settles it. So critique was, from the start, not a subjective act in the history he gives us, but a certain juridical scene. Koselleck traces the modern breakdown and reconfiguration of this scene, noting how criticism has become associated with subjective acts, and crisis denotes a crucial moment in the advance of a disease, say, in which a decision has to be made and is therefore considered more objectively. Although decision does seem at first to be a subjective act, it belongs in Koselleck's history to an objective situation of disarray, when the political order that is supposed to be organized by good judgment can no longer be presumed. Critique then emerges from an historical situation of disarray, a way of diagnosing and arbitrating this situation of lost or questionable authority. When Koselleck briefly does read Kant, he understands him as leading the charge of the sovereign critics who threaten the full displacement of sovereign political authority. We can conjecture that this is one potential meaning of the Kantian claim that critique is to be understood as a revolution at the level of procedure. But But it seems odd to attribute a radical position to Kant, although I have friends who believe in the red Kant. It's okay. On the one hand, Kant paid tribute to Frederick the Great and argued explicitly that philosophy depends upon the state to safeguard its freedom of thought. On the other hand, Kant argued in the 1781 preface to the Critique of Pure Reason that our age is, in a special degree, the age of criticism, and to criticism, he wrote, everything must submit. And he went on to say that neither religious nor political authority could exempt themselves from this process of submitting to criticism. It would seem that criticism is installed as the superior, if not ultimate, form of judgment, one that does not make subjective critical judgment sovereign in relation to state power. One that does make that judgment sovereign in relation to state power. For the obvious implication of Kant's own thought is not one that he would pursue. That implication is that if a state fails to submit to critique, and critique is understood as a tribunal that considers and judges the claim of legitimacy that any state makes, that state would lose its claim to legitimate authority, right? So a state that suppresses critique is a state that loses its own legitimacy, since its legitimacy can only be established through judgment and critical judgment in particular. Hannah Arendt was perhaps more drawn to this strain of Kantianism than Kant himself. After all, it is Kant who wrote that the right to rebel is incoherent, since it gives the people sovereign power, and only the state can have sovereign power, right? So, specifically, he argues that a condition in which there can be rights is one that has departed from the state of nature, and is possible, I quote, only when there is some means for individuals to be governed by the general legislative will, and the general legislative will is embodied in the state. So, any state that embodies the general legislative will is better than no state. What he calls a rightful condition, that is to say, a condition that makes rights possible, requires the centralizing of coercive power in a state as the only means of bringing reciprocal coercion and obligation. The right to resist a state could only then be authorized by the state, and therefore it is incoherent. Now, of course, the way he ends that argument is to say there is no popular sovereignty, there's only state sovereignty. The way I want to end that argument is to say state sovereignty that does not submit to the judgment of popular sovereignty is illegitimate. Okay, I'm trying to say that. But his view is true only to the extent that popular sovereignty is considered a contradiction of terms. If only the state can embody sovereign power, then the people, understood as the subjects of the state, only have rights by virtue of that state and are subject to that state as sovereign power even as they claim their own power. Of course, that contradiction dissolves once popular sovereignty proves no longer to depend upon the state formation from which it breaks. This then raises the question of how we are supposed to understand the tribunal that Kant associates with critique. In some sense, it is Kant's book itself, for he understands the first critique to be answering, and I quote, a call to reason, to institute a tribunal which will assure to reason its lawful claims and dismiss all groundless pretensions, not by despotic decrees, but in accordance with its own eternal and unalterable laws. This tribunal, he writes, is no other than the critique of pure reason. So, in this sense, we might say critique acts like law. Perhaps it even takes the place of law. And yet, whatever tribunal this is cannot be housed simply in experience, or at least it cannot be housed exclusively there, since it must belong to the faculty of reason in an a priori way, and so be something that we cannot precisely see or touch or know within the sensible world, the world available to our senses. So this seems to mean that we follow the various pathways, if we follow them, of the first critique, the reflexive examination of intuition, concept, synthesis, and judgment. We're caught in a kind of bind. Kant appeals to the public domain as the place where this adjudication should take place, suggesting that critique is part of an ongoing public process or debate on matters of who can claim ultimate authority, who or what can claim ultimate sovereignty. And that involves examining claims to sovereign power for their legitimacy and the exercise of sovereign judgment. When he declares that religion must also submit to this tribunal, he elaborates that critique is a free and public examination of its claims. The claims of religion and politics, and I quote again, cannot claim the sincere respect which reason accords only to that which has been able to sustain the test of free and open examination. When Kant claims that this tribunal is nothing other than the critique of pure reason itself, he differentiates it from, and I quote, that battlefield of endless controversies called metaphysics. An adjudicative law emerges to put an end to battle. Whatever form of judgment this is, it seeks to transform a state of war or embattlement into one of civility and reason, if not perpetual peace. For at least in the prefaces to his various critiques, he retells a saga of the rise and fall of monarchies, the vacillation between despotism and anarchy, the rise of the rule of tedium in which human nature has turned against itself. And when critique emerges as a court of justice, it appears that an end to all of that sorry history is upon us. We will finally have an adjudicator, a just and sovereign adjudication. But this matter of critique is not only a stationary court or a tribunal, it's also described as a kind of movement, indeed a path, one that he calls the only path left and the most difficult task. It poses a set of burdensome questions, some of which are impossible to answer. So the solid and stationary character of critique gives way to something that is open-ended and unfinished. Architectural metaphors organize and compel the intuition, but they do not quite hold. We are, with critique, moving through space, understood to be on our way. So this overlong consideration of Kant leads us to separate problematics, and bear with me because I'm about to turn to politics in a way that I hope will be helpful to you. On the one hand, there's a question of whether critique is subjective or objective, whether it actually bridges that division in the way that Koselleck suggests it can. Kant's metaphors are not stable here. On the one hand, he tells us, for critique, one must look no further than oneself, as if each of us has the judgment we need as part of our own subjective faculty. And yet, on the other hand, he also tells us that critique seems to emerge in the midst of an ongoing conflictual juridical process, one that can also be regarded as a kind of historical pathology if we take Koselleck's view. If Kant's text oscillates between a subjective and objective rendition of critique, positing a mind that is above the law, positing judgment as a kind of law-governed and law-giving exercise, and yet also a public deliberation, an open examination of competing claims of sovereign authority, it's because the location of critique cannot be firmly identified. There are consequences to each part of his view that he apparently cannot bear to elaborate. The first is that sovereign judgment takes precedence over the state's claim to sovereignty, a view that conflicts directly with his idea of the state as the condition of all rights claims. The second is that critique is a popular activity, the function of a public debate, in which the people, whoever they may be, weigh the claims of authority made on behalf of religion and state, skepticism and dogmatism, and come up with their own view. That conclusion is, of course, unacceptable. For as he claims, critique can never be popular, even though it is in principle possible for any rational being to do. In other words, it's possible for any human, but there will never be a majority who can do it, since the vast majority lack education or capacity. His own Orientalism comes in here, so also does his misogyny. It is as if in Kant, within a span of a few paragraphs, a radical democratic potential is opened up only to be closed down quite emphatically. If the law belongs to the state, then the tribunal of critique either belongs to that state or it has an autonomous, possibly sovereign status, not unlike other tribunals we know, human rights tribunals like the Russell Tribunal or other non-state forms of adjudication that seek to hold states accountable for the illegitimate use of their power. Indeed, the post-Kantian trajectory of critique is one in which too often the possibility of a public adjudication of state legitimacy is subject to censorship, as we see in Turkey and in Palestine, where arbitration can go on indefinitely and without a conclusion, as with land rights petitions made by indigenous peoples, or indeed where the absence of sovereign decision unleashes forms of bio and necropolitics that are not easily tracked to a single state or to a sovereign authority. I think we see the waning or the absence of sovereign authority as well in Mexico, where the deaths of the 43 students from Ayotzinapa still have not been redressed and still have not been acknowledged by the state. So all of these are examples of an ongoing problem of how to describe a form of power in which sovereignty seems to be in place only to be absent or dispersed, even if its effects are still felt. Law is structured by a temporal process that no longer follows the dramatic narrative of the tribunal that concludes with a clear and final judgment, even the dispensation of punishment. In Kant, we saw a spatial oscillation of this idea of the tribunal between the mind and the public, and a suggestion that a certain kind of public mind is manifest in disputation and debate, a kind of critical activity. But now, in this particular now, the one that I'm describing, our historical now, the dramatic narrative that celebrates law or adjudication seems to have taken a different turn, for law in the service of state power and state violence belongs to a temporality of intermittent and indefinite detention. The law that does not arbitrate dispute, as much as it becomes a modality of administrative power, becomes a law that is in the service of state power and potentially of state violence. It's the temporality of indefinite detention which marks the character of administrative violence. When the temporal horizon is saturated in this way, the ideal of an operative and just tribunal appears to be a fiction. Indeed, fictions become, as a result, one of the major modalities within which to think this contemporary problem of law. Kafka's Trial, published in 1925, but written a decade earlier, prefigured all too well the violence of the law, as well as the violence of those administrative powers spawned in the ambient world of the law. When one opens Kafka's text, one expects the novel to follow a dramatic narrative sequence. First there's an accusation, then there's pre-trial proceedings, the submission of evidence, a trial, a judgment, possibly punishment or exoneration. And yet, one never moves past the accusation. Indeed, the accusation becomes a kind of pre-trial proceeding without end. Indeed, the accusation becomes a kind of judgment that has already been made. The accusation actually turns out from the start to be the punishment. Punishment begins with accusation, continues through the pre-trial proceeding, which itself becomes a form of indefinite detention. Not within the prison wall, but within the world, now structured by the absolute loss of the reliable tribunal. Of course, we know from various sources, Walter Benjamin included, that legal resolutions do not imply a departure from violence. And yet, even Benjamin made room for a kind of civil procedure of conflict resolution that would take place outside the terms of law. And I want to suggest to you that this has strong resonances with this sense of critique as extra-legal tribunal, drawing in a way on the metaphorics of law without exactly becoming law. Indeed, for Benjamin, any inquiry, any statement, any action that calls into question the framework of legal violence is critical, but it will itself be called violent precisely by the state powers that seek to contain and quash any threat to the rule of law. Interestingly, the only time that Benjamin explicitly names nonviolence in his critique of violence is when he refers to a nonviolent conflict resolution that takes place through a technique of civil governance. This technique is important because it is not governed by any specific end. It resembles more closely a way of life, a way of living with disputes, a disputatious way of living. As a technique, it's governed neither by an instrumental logic nor by a teleology. It's ongoing, open-ended, what he calls a pure means, and in this way, it is another name for a developing notion of critique as an active mode of thought that is also a mode of life outside the terms of law in relation to the law. In fact, Benjamin, in an emphatically, I would say, anarchist moment, writes, and I quote, that a totally nonviolent resolution of conflicts can never lead to a legal contract, since for him, the legal contract reintroduces violence into the scene. He later clarifies that, and I quote again, there's a sphere of human agreement that is nonviolent to the extent that it is wholly inaccessible to violence, the proper sphere of understanding, language, die eigentliche Sphäre der Verständigung, die Sprache. Well, he kind of loses me there, but still, the point is not that somehow speech moves us out of violence, but rather that there are kinds of understanding that can be achieved through language, especially an understanding that counts as an ongoing arbitration of conflict, and that this kind of understanding that contains the conflict, mobilizes and sustains the conflict in an open-ended way, constitutes an alternative to legal violence and can be understood to be nonviolent, so conflictual but nonviolent. There is no sovereign tribunal to which conflicts can be submitted, at least not for Benjamin. There is only a civil technique. I think Gramsci would like it, maybe, okay. A civil technique of governance outside the law, but not for that reason criminal. It is what renders law superfluous, or that which actively seeks to forestall the violence of law. Now, Benjamin's remarks on this topic are very brief, and I'm not sure how much any of us can build upon them. But I do find it interesting that dispute and conflict are presupposed as part of civic life, and that the technique of governance applied to conflict is ongoing, potentially coextensive with life itself. Perhaps there is no life without conflict, agonism, and the question is whether a non-legal technique can be cultivated that accepts and works with conflict in an ongoing way, not to eliminate it, but to forestall forms of violence, both legal and extra-legal. So let me then turn to two examples for understanding not only legal violence, but administrative violence, and the problem of conducting critique or critical theory in the absence of the tribunal, in the wake of the longing for the ultimate tribunal in some sort of public mind, the legal condition of living under occupation and the legal condition of refugees. These may seem like two distinct topics, but when one considers the numbers of Palestinians who remain refugees, many of whom now cohabiting in refugee camps in the south of Lebanon, we see these are quite literally converging phenomena. This will allow me, I believe, to make contact with the themes of sovereignty and social movements that is central to this academy. To live under occupation means precisely that one may be detained at any moment, without clear reason and without due process. And though the law stipulates that one cannot be detained without a trial for more than several months, one can be arrested again and again as a kind of harassment and as a show of the arbitrary exercise of Israeli military power. It would be rare, if not impossible, to find a family or community in the West Bank, for instance, without a member who has been incarcerated, and not just once, but many times. And when incarceration does occur, it's characterized by an indefinite deferral of established or recognizable legal rights. Of course, legal rights are already restricted under colonial rule. There are no rights of citizenship in Palestine. There's no rights of free expression or freedom of assembly, no rights that we might understand as expressing political self-determination. A group of people gets together to object to something that happened or to a policy or a rule. That is a security problem. It is the equivalent of a riot. So when every exercise of the right of assembly gets called a riot, there is no right of assembly. Okay, we'll just make sure we're on the same page. Occupation, as an extended form of colonial power, is itself a modality in which rights are indefinitely deferred, a form of living in time where law is suspended, but where legal means are now the central means of administrative power and violence, and where hope for an effective reversal of this protracted injustice is indefinitely deferred. Indeed, the Oslo Accord is the indefinite deferral of justice, right? Because it said after 5 years, authority would be shifted to the Palestinian people. 5 years came and went. No shift. Indeed, occupation is the intensification of dispossession, even if sometimes whole populations are dispossessed on the very land where they live and have lived. They are no longer owners, subject to arrest and detention, deprived of citizenship and self-determination. When a deal like the Oslo Accords is made that stipulates that occupation will come to an end in a specific period of time, and it is then broken, the occupation is without time limit. It is the intensified expression of indefinite detention, not only in the prison, but in the world, structured by a subjugation without foreseeable end. It is a condition of life under which it is as certain as breathing, as certain as dying, that someone from a household living under occupation will be incarcerated not once but many times. There is no occupation without incarceration, and no life untouched by its violence. Administrative detainees are arrested by the Israeli occupying forces on the basis of Military Order 1226, which empowers military commanders to detain an individual for up to 6 months if they have reasonable grounds to presume that the security of the area or public security requires the detention. On or just before the expiration date, the detention order is frequently renewed. This process can be continued indefinitely. So what this means is that the arbitrary power of Israeli military personnel is expanded. It's a power that is already wielded under non-incarcerated conditions of occupation, and it becomes intensified and localized when exercised as the power of incarceration itself. The army, the guards, the arbiters can decide to revoke a release when they believe that a person threatens the state of Israel. But that's the broad rubric. This person threatens the state of Israel. But under conditions in which the call to end the occupation is itself considered a threat to the Israeli state, right? If you mobilize to end the occupation, you are threatening the Israeli state, because apparently the Israeli state depends on the occupation in order to be the Israeli state. At least that's how my background in philosophy induces me to read that claim. I mean, a logical claim is, okay, sorry. Under conditions, okay, anyone engaged in a resistance or liberation struggle will be considered a threat to the security of the state of Israel. Only those who actively accept the extension, the indefinite extension of settler colonialism, which happens, by the way, not only through settlements, but also through the military occupation of Palestinian lands, will not be considered security risks. But given the arbitrary nature of delegated power to the Israeli army, one might still find oneself in prison. But if one who is part of a resistance struggle or a political movement for liberation from colonial rule, if one is part of that, then one is surely a security risk to the state, a threat to the security of colonial rule, and is at intensified risk of incarceration. The contemporary refugee crisis raises other kinds of questions that I can barely touch upon here, especially in Italy. But it does raise questions about crisis, critique, and violence amassed at the borders of Europe, considering how many thousands of people have attempted and are attempting to cross the Mediterranean from Libya or Turkey or other sites. I can't do justice to that issue here. But as you doubtless know, the United Nations Migration Agency reports that 77,000 migrants and refugees entered Europe by sea in 2017 through June 14th, and I believe that another couple thousand have been added since that time, with almost 85% arriving in Italy, and the remainder divided among Greece, Cyprus, and Spain. This compares with 214,000 arrivals across the region through June 14th, 2016. There have already been 2,000 deaths this year, almost equal to the number from all of 2016, and we are only halfway through. As those of you from Italy know very well, the debates on this issue within Europe do not explicitly raise the question of whether these are lives that have rights, that deserve not to be abandoned at sea, even though that is an active debate. But what I want to suggest to you is the question that's not posed explicitly is whether these lives are grievable, whether they are worthy of grief, whether it matters if they are lost. Because if you designate a population as already lost, right, if it's already negated, if it's already not human, if it's already not humanity, if it's already not belonging to that population who has candidates for rights, then this is not a subject of rights who has been wronged, nor is it a recognizable life that can be grieved. And I want to suggest that grievability and the possibility of a rights claim are linked, that the ungrievable cannot make a claim because they are not constituted as a subject of rights. If the numbers of people abandoned at sea or dying at sea were all Europeans, I think that we would hear a deafening outcry. We do not always hear it. But one question, of course, that this raises, I've talked about administrative violence, I've talked about possibilities of nonviolence, but what's the kind of violence at work when lives are left to languish or forced into conditions of possible or probable death? I say forced into dying, even though I probably should just say killed, but I want to hold on to the indirect way in which death dealing takes place. We could ask, who is leaving the populations at sea in such cases? And if we put the question that way, we should be trying to find the individuals or the policymakers, the people who made those terrible votes, who make those terrible decisions, who took the money of those whose political fear they exploited. But perhaps we should be considering the policies which are reproduced time and again that orchestrate the abandonment of populations who are seeking shelter, legal passage, food, movement, belonging, and futurity. There are, of course, officials who decide, and there are individuals who take their boats out on a daily basis to try to assist in the transport of those who cannot cross the sea with the boats and conditions they face. It's important to mark that. But the broader policies circulate and normalize, and they depend on operative conceits of national sovereignty, as well as ethnically pure notions of the nation state. And these serve as higher principles than the international accords, which should be protecting anyone at sea, and which are, once again, repeatedly and indefinitely suspended. That supervenient assertion of sovereignty depends upon a border, and yet the border, however it is drawn, and precisely because it is drawn, is always to a certain degree imagined, a site for the articulation of imagined nationality. What does sovereignty do? Well, it bounds, preserves, it protects and defends. It also expels and purifies, barricading itself against a racial contamination figured as the destruction of the nation, especially when sovereignty is linked with the nation state and its preservation of a very specific racial conception, racial or religious conception of nationality. Indeed, the border not only separates one space from another, the border takes up space and organizes space. It's less a dividing line between legal entities than an extra-legal zone in which some laws are suspended and others exercise their prohibitive force in tandem with systematically induced forms of expulsion, abandonment, and death dealing. The border is a spatial articulation of those forms of legal violence, legal protection, sovereign decision, and biopower, or perhaps we should really call it necropower, following Achille Mbembe's important critique of Foucault. At the same time, the border is re-articulated in time. It's a way of organizing time, distinguishing time and again between who may move and who may not move, who has a future and whose future is foreclosed, whose life is grievable and whose is not. The Mediterranean is carved into distinct national territories, but it's also managed by maritime laws adopted by the surrounding countries. The Barcelona Convention, adopted in 1975, enjoined 16 different nations to protect the sea, preserve biodiversity, and also assume common responsibility for emergency situations on the sea. International maritime law stipulates the obligation to offer assistance to those in distress without regard to the nationality, status, or circumstances of the person or people at risk. We find this same principle reiterated in the International Convention on Maritime Search and Rescue, 1979, and then again in 1982, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The activist group Watch the Med, which receives and relays SOS calls from refugees imperiled on the Mediterranean, describes the regulatory powers that govern the sea in the following way. Maritime jurisdictions today resemble an unbundled sovereignty in which the state's rights and obligations that compose modern state sovereignty on the land are decoupled from each other and are applied to varying degrees depending on the territory, the jurisdiction, and the specific kind of emergency or crisis. Sovereignty is unbundled in the sense that sovereign claims, that is to say, claims made on behalf of a sovereign power, are limited, distributed, connected, and disconnected, producing a strategic field in which one claim can take priority over another depending on the circumstance, but there is no one principle that has supervenient status. In other words, there is no tribunal, there is no ultimate supervenient law according to which all these various kinds of claims are arbitrated. We will not find the tribunal that can settle these conflicts in space and time. So regardless of our assessment of the politics of humanitarianism, it is surely good to know that according to the United Nations conventions that govern the sea, the obligation to extend aid applies without regard to nationality, status, or circumstances of the person or people in distress. This is a broad and relatively simple rule. It's non-enforceable. It applies to ship owners, shipmasters, coastal nations, and flag states, that is, states where ships are registered. They each bear equal responsibility for search and rescue. And yet, periodic eruptions of state sovereignty contest the reach and applicability of such a convention that tries to bind sovereign nations together in an agreement, but whose status is, of course, what? It's a non-state-centered form of sovereign status that has no enforceability. As Watch the Med explains, that unbundled sovereignty, which is the Mediterranean, describes the power that governs the sea and produces the situation in which a state's rights and obligations that compose modern state sovereignty on the land are decoupled from each other and applied selectively. This allows states to extend their capacity to control vessels beyond their boundaries, but also attempt to retract themselves from the obligations defined by national and international law, end quote. Since the enforcement of the so-called Dublin regulation, which sets out that the first state of entry of an asylum seeker in the European Union is responsible for following his or her claim, coastal states have been increasingly hesitant to disembark migrants intercepted at sea and have practiced pushbacks, deporting them without considering their claim to asylum. So the pushback happens at the border or even beyond the border, right, in an effort to protect the border, which is itself supposed to be a protection. And that seems necessary in order to make the claim that, hey, those refugees did not actually arrive in the country. They did not actually pass into the jurisdiction that is bound by the Dublin regulation to process their asylum. Indeed, arguments are increasingly made that, hey, migrants who passed through or who were not processed, who were held or contained, did not actually arrive, right? Technically speaking, they never arrived. And those who were pushed back from the border by boats, they definitely did not arrive. They were passing through or they were passing around, and the nation state in question was nothing other than a transit route. And in some cases, some people can be detained and motionless in detention centers, and they still, legally speaking, have not arrived. In other words, nothing triggers the legal obligation. So even if the refugees are stationary and stuck, their status is argued as in transit or passing through. Indeed, under this condition, in which states seek to deploy the border to argue that refugees are not arriving, have not arrived, but are passing through indefinitely, in a state of passing through, we have no option but once again to call upon Kafka to help clarify the legal situation at the border. The Messiah comes, you might remember from his parables, not on the day of his arrival, but on the very last day. The refugee comes, but never on the day of his or her arrival, and still does not arrive when she arrives, not even on the very last day. How do we think about the fact that the SOS signals are received? Malta receives them, Italy receives them, Greece receives them, sometimes relayed by MedWatch itself, and sometimes refused or not acknowledged. The indirect assertion of national autonomy and sovereignty at the expense of lives destroys the systems of obligation that govern that sea with impunity. There may be no precise sovereign decision to kill, and yet the invocation of sovereignty under certain conditions becomes the means by which populations are abandoned to death and responsibility is disavowed. The sovereign need only say, I didn't get the message. I didn't get the call. Nobody made a claim on me. For it's not just that the boat happened to capsize, but that the boats are themselves, as you know, unregulated, illegal, and it's not just that some responsible government had its own fleets too far away at the time and wasn't that lamentable. It's rather that when a government refuses the call, invoking sovereignty, they do so because they don't want to be responsible for granting asylum or for processing those refugees. The unbundled character of state sovereignty means that sovereignty is differently operative in a loosely connected set of laws, and that a state can shift from one set of laws to another, even shift the jurisdiction, national or international, under which it acts at any given time when it is of convenience. So though refusing to respond to the call from a sinking boat does not take the form of a judge pronouncing a death sentence, we might argue that morally and politically we are looking at its equivalent. The sea is, at that moment, a contested set of sovereign territories. But even then, the non-nationals who enter into that maritime space are not covered by sovereign power. The sovereign power lets the maritime contract lapse, a repeated failure to honor the conventions that have been paradoxically signed by the sovereign.
It's this one, it's not working.
Okay, I'm almost done. I'm on my last page. I'll yell. I'll yell. Okay, it seems like I'm building. I'm really about to end. Okay. Failing to respond draws the jurisdictional line, reinforcing and reprioritizing sovereignty in the act. The refugees do not belong to the population whose lives that sovereign is bound to protect or preserve. The sovereign represents the sovereign nation, the nation state, devoted to stoking the imaginary of the nation in its racial or ethnic purity. So those who enter are disenfranchised, abandoned, imperiled, or left to die, covered by no binding obligation. At such a moment, I would argue, such populations are established as ungrievable lives. The resistance against this abandonment and this form of death dealing is, I would suggest, centrally engaged with the radical assertion of grievability and the operation of critique. Where there is no tribunal, we must be the tribunal. It is important to understand the forms of resistance that emerge under such conditions. Perhaps you know the German newspaper, The Daily Resistance. I wish to conclude only by suggesting that critique has always been bound up with the problem of crisis and that of law, of legal crisis itself, and with the presumption of dispute and conflict, the actual or potential outbreak of violence, and the necessity for judgment in the midst of an historical process whose end is not altogether foreseeable. The Kantian ideal of the tribunal that would at once establish a sovereign power or arbitration as just has itself transformed over space and time, becoming for Benjamin an extra-legal mode of understanding, a technique for common life that may well do without violence, but never without conflict. When law becomes the instrument of violence and administrative power becomes its own form of quasi-legal or extra-legal violence, then the problem is not just the death-dealing power of the sovereign. We have a new modality of violence. We have administrative violence. And yet in the Mediterranean, it's precisely through the invocation of sovereignty that international obligations are abandoned and calls for assistance refused. There, the sovereign looks the other way. And that glance can and does spell death for many. I'm certainly not arguing against law as such, for I think, for instance, that international maritime covenants and contracts should be revised to become consistent and enforceable, and they should be honored. But I am aware that critique is precisely what becomes politically obligatory during times when violence assumes sovereign legal and administrative forms, and where judgment either becomes a form of violence or its arrival is indefinitely postponed. Under conditions of historical urgency, we judge as we go, sometimes in a rush, in a crisis, responding to the knowledge we can gain, exiled from certainty. Although I think we are perhaps far from Kant, he shadows us as we seek to find firmer ground to judge the historical conditions of our own predicaments of knowing. In the end, we see how hard it is to know and oppose violence when its workings go unnamed or when it operates precisely through those modes of sovereignty and law that are charged ideally with the arbitration of conflict, but now become the ways of conducting forms of legal death and dying. Critique emerges here at this moment when we grasp the reversal and its consequences, when we register the crisis, respond, and resist its normalization. In the absence of any tribunal that would name, judge, and stop the injustice, we are left with critique unmoored from law, making them in judgment, embodied in popular and growing resistance. Thank you.